Hello, everyone, and welcome to level 2, session 1 of the Berkeley Accessible Music Education Study Group, our spring 2023 edition. I'm Dr. Rhoda Bernard. I'm the founding managing director of the Institute for Accessible Arts Education and assistant chair of the music education department at Berklee College of Music. I'm coming to you live from Boston. And what we'll do is get started with some logistics, and then we'll get to the work. And what we're going to do here, first of all, for all of you to know, this webinar is being recorded. The recordings will be sent out no later than Tuesday morning. They take a long time to process. And you're going to get the slides. So you don't need to take screenshots of slides and scribble furiously. All of that's coming to you. That will come also early next week. So this slideshow, which is about logistics, is one that you will receive. So our study group has 6 synchronous days of sessions. Today, next week, the 13th. So today in the morning, I did a session on students with disabilities and big picture strategies. This afternoon, we're going to talk about neurodiversity and models of disability. Next week, there'll be a session on general music with Nadia Castagna, and the afternoon session will be starting at 2:30 p.m. rather than at 1 p.m., just that one time, so that Tomas Marquez can work with us on technology. May 20th, the morning session is about working with students with high support needs. And Rachel Weisoff will be leading that session. In the afternoon, there'll be a session on accessible band with Shana Pistilli and accessible chorus with Marissa Giangregorio. And then we take off a week because it is Memorial Day weekend. And we come back on June 3rd. The level 1 session that day is a deep dive into universal design for learning with Rhiannon Gutierrez. And then the afternoon session has 2 parts. The first is about drum circles and using musical notation in different adaptive ways for students with disabilities. And that's Gretchen Hari. And then Kayla McLaughlin in the second part will be looking at the private studio setting. And then on June 10th, in the morning, I will do more advanced teaching strategies and get deep into assessment of student work and student performances for students with disabilities. And then in the afternoon, Victoria Laricchia will be doing a session on behavior management. And then the final day, June 17th, both the morning and afternoon sessions are devoted to projects, which we're about to talk about. So as I said, you'll get video recordings. It says no later than Monday. I want to say Tuesday morning because there are times where it takes so long for the videos to process that I can't get them out. You'll probably get multiple messages because the files are quite large. You can participate in this study group as much or as little as you would like. However, if you want full participation, which gets you a certificate of participation, and if you're in Massachusetts, professional development points, then you have to do the following. You have to attend 18 hours of sessions. That can be all level 1, all level 2, or a mixture of both. It can be all synchronous, all asynchronous, or a mixture of both. You must do 5 between session engagement activities, which are prompts on Google Docs for you to respond to after each of the first 5 days of sessions. Those Google Docs will get sent to you. And you must create and present a study group project. In order to get a certificate, you need to do all of those things. And we send them out a few weeks after the full set of sessions has taken place so that the folks who are asynchronous have time to catch up. So what is a project? So we want to make this adult learning meaningful to you. So aside from the time we spend working together and the time you spend between the sessions, we want you to be applying some aspect of what you learn to your own teaching practice. There are lots of ways this could happen. I list a few examples here, but really it's some piece of what you've learned applied to your teaching and then reporting on what you did, what you plan to do, what you learned, right? These are works in progress. We don't have that much time together. So we don't want to be too ambitious. We want to think about the projects as a snapshot of your application of what you're learning here and how you want to share that with us. Depending on what you do is going to depend on how you document it. And we have these presentation sessions on June 17th, where you'll get 5 minutes to present your project. So we want to keep them brief. I'll provide feedback to the projects, and people who submit projects but are not able to attend one of the sessions, I will present the project on your behalf. So we want you to start thinking about this now. There'll be a Google Doc for you to put in your tentative ideas, and I can respond to you in there so you can see. The biggest mistake people make is they want to do too much. So think about something small and manageable that will help make what we work on together a meaningful part of your practice. So I'll take questions at the end of our session when we look at these again. So I'm going to pull up today's presentation. Give me 1 second to get that squared away here. Good. And we're going to get right to it. And I see that we have mostly people who weren't here this morning, which is good because the introductory stuff will be a little bit of a repetition for those of you who were here this morning, but that's cool. So we're going to share this presentation and start it from the beginning as a slideshow. So we're going to be looking today at neurodiversity, models of disability, language, and their implications for teaching and learning. So we're going to, this is our agenda. There's going to be some introduction to me and to the work of my institute, and then we'll get right into it. The concept of neurodiversity, how that relates to models of disability, what we need to know about language, and what the implications are for teaching and learning. So I'm not going to read all of this information about me to you. Interesting things to know. I began this work of the Institute when I was the chair of music education at Boston Conservatory. I started there in 2004, and I began the work of the Institute in 2007. The Institute as an entity was created in 2016 when we merged. Boston Conservatory and Berklee College of Music merged legally, and I was one of the very first people brought over in the merger, and we created this institute. We changed our name. We used to be called the Institute for Arts Education and Special Needs, and that phrase, special needs, we'll be talking about it later, is now considered offensive by the disability community. So we changed our name to the Institute for Accessible Arts Education as of this past October. So that's enough about me and what brought me to this work. I'd like to share this short video, which we shot last July, which introduces you to the work of the Institute.
At Guitar Center, one of his favorite places. It's like a kid in a candy store. And he'll just start playing with accompanying whatever song is going on. People have stopped to listen. I mean, and then they say, wow, what do you do? Where do you get? And I'm Berklee, the Berklee program. That's what I say to them, because that's where he does all this.
Music education is one of the most transformative departments at our institution. When we merged with the Boston Conservatory, one of the jewels in the crown was the formation of the Institute for Accessible Arts Education.
That merger made it possible for us to create the Institute and for us to expand the art forms that we work in, so not just music, and the disability populations that we work with, not just autism. And that has continued to grow.
In our program, we celebrate what makes people different and encourage these young artists to be themselves.
I love classic rock and modern rock. Bands like Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and AC/DC, and Black Sabbath, Motorhead.
Zach is one of the students who I've worked with closely and very directly as a mentor. Developing his musicianship, I give him some degree of career counseling and some advice for the professional world.
We get to see those very, very first interactions with music We get to discover these 3-year-olds that have perfect pitch, who memorize a song the first time they hear it. We get to see these little sparks, and we get to take it as far as they will go.
I think it's a human right to get to experience music and make music with other people and express yourself through music.
I'm the proud mother of Ashton. He was nonverbal until he was about 7. Then he starts singing along, and I'm like, whoa. And he is fully verbal right now.
You were the shadow to my life.
He's very snarky, he's got this little personality, and he loves his teachers at Berklee.
Ashton's the best. Like, he's such a funny kid. These kids are so full of life and full of personality. They spend so much of their time in a society that tries to like stifle who they are, and then they're in a musical setting where they can really thrive and be themselves and be creative, and it's like you just watch them blossom.
One of the special things about our program is that it is linked to a master's degree in music education with an autism concentration. It's the only program like it in the country.
Students know when the teacher doesn't believe in them, oh yes. And they also know when the teacher does. Arts educators receive almost no training and very little support in how to teach anybody who's not a typical, whatever that is, learner.
Whatever the change is, but there's other ways to teach that include everybody, and that's what we're learning about in my courses.
Studying music ed and autism and getting to also teach hands-on, the two really inform one another.
We're all sharing experiences that we've had and influencing each other in ways that we never would have been able to had this program not existed.
Welcome to the final performance.
I learn so much from my students every day about what is communication, what is music making, what is good music, what's a musical experience.
And so I really try to enter their realm. I try to understand how they understand the world by watching how they interact with the world.
It's a joyful experience to see them really shine and to know that I played a small part in getting them there. But it's also been humbling because I'm constantly reminded that I'm never going to fully see the world through somebody else's eyes or walk in somebody else's shoes.
When you have all of the labels that he has, there's this expectation everywhere that he's pretty limited. And it's actually quite the opposite.
He has a T-shirt that says, "Autism is my superpower." Really, it's a superpower that helps all of us to be more and to stretch more and understand more and be more flexible.
I am really having a great time here at Berklee. And thanks so much for your time.
So that introduces you a bit to what we do at the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education, where we are a catalyst for the inclusion of people with disabilities in all aspects of visual and performing arts education. We have coined the acronym ABLE, which stands for Arts Better the Lives of Everyone. The work that we do is in 3 main streams. First, we have direct service programs, arts education programs for people with disabilities, ages 3 to 93. We serve about 300 people every week in our arts education programs, which include 13 music programs, 2 adaptive dance programs, and a theater program. Some of the programs are performance-based, like the various ensembles and private lessons. Others are more class-based, like music technology, music history, ear training, and coming this fall, music theory. We also offer graduate programs. They were referenced in the video. While we work with all disability populations in our programs and in our work, our academic focus at Berkeley is on autism spectrum disorder. And we have a Master of Music and Music Education with an autism concentration and a graduate certificate in music education and autism. These programs are unique. There's no other program like them. They are designed for working teachers. So classes are in the summers and then in the evenings during the academic year. And the master's degree is for someone who is looking for a master's degree, while the graduate certificate is for someone who already has a master's degree or doesn't need a master's degree, but wants focused coursework and a credential. These are the 5 graduate seminars that are the autism core. They are part of the master's degree, and taken alone, they are the grad certificate. There's a course in the foundations and practices of special education, and always in what the implications are for music education. There's a deep dive into autism spectrum disorders from every perspective: historical, sociological, psychological, physical, critical, you name it. There's a course that looks at behavioral teaching methods and maps them on to music education for people with autism. And then there are 2 courses in research to practice, where the students read and critique research and then apply it and see how it applies in various aspects of real world teaching practice. And there are some more graduate students. We do the 3rd stream is professional development. We do a whole lot of different kinds of professional development, including, of course, this study group. But we do a lot of different things that allow the field to gain access to more resources, techniques, contacts, etc. So our flagship professional development event is our annual Able Assembly Conference. It was just 2 weeks ago, and it will be April 19th to 21st, 2024. It is hybrid. You can be in person or online. We have a fall symposium, which is always the Saturday before Thanksgiving. That is a hybrid event, 1-day event, and it's really provocative speakers to help us move the conversation forward. We offer study groups like this one. We offer workshops and mini courses. I've done some online course development and teaching. We have an online searchable database of arts educator resources for working with students with disabilities. That's our Able Arts Resource Center. You can keyword search lesson plans, blogs, articles, book chapters, assessments, teaching tools, you name it. We have a very active blog of our own known as Able Snapshots. We do consultations with arts organizations, schools, school districts, and artists. We have a network that is national and international, bringing together leaders of the field for peer learning and support. We have a very active podcast that is guest hosted by different disabled artists. And I'm get the good fortune of doing a lot of keynoting as well. So now we're going to get to the topic of the day, which is neurodiversity. And I want to start with everyone taking a moment to reflect on what you know about neurodiversity. Let's reflect and throw some of your reflections in the Q&A. So when you have a reflection, what is neurodiversity? What would you say? Throw it in the Q&A and then we'll talk about it. What is neurodiversity? A unique way someone learns in the world. I like that. I like that a lot, Allison. Good to see you here. Neurodiversity is a unique way someone learns in the world. The idea that all brains process information differently, yes. Hadi, I don't know your first name, but thank you for that. That is definitely part of neurodiversity. What else can we say about neurodiversity? What is neurodiversity? People are unique and process and or interact with the world around them differently. Fantastic. I'm going to give it another moment and then move on. The answer so far is yes, and there's more, but I love it. A little more time. My timer closer. Okay, let's go on and talk about neurodiversity. So neurodiversity, the term was coined in the early 1990s and was coined by a person named Judy Singer in her master's thesis, which has since been published in a small monograph called Neurodiversity, the Birth of an Idea. And the thesis was called, Why Can't You Be Normal for Once in Your Life? From a problem with no name to the emergence of a new category of difference. Now, remember, this was written in the early 1990s and then later published in that monograph. What Judy Singer was trying to do is to add neurologically different, she had multiple levels of things going on at the political level, at the societal level, on a personal note, a lot of different things. Politically, she was really thinking about race, class, and gender. And remember, this is in the 90s, the way we were thinking about it then, and thinking that neurologically different needs to be another such category, that we need to understand that aspect of people's identities. She wanted to make sure that people understand that the neurodivergent population, people who are neurodiverse, are not eccentrics or social outcasts and should not be excluded or mistreated, although that has been, up to that point, what had been happening. Rather, that neurodiversity has to do with hardwired neurological differences. It's in the biology, rather than a personality flaw that is the person's fault, which is how it was being cast back then. And also not a psychological problem caused by bad parenting. Believe it or not, the notion of the refrigerator mother, who was the cause of different neurodivergent diagnoses, particularly autism, but others, held on in the medical community and in society at large for a very long time. And so Judy Singer is speaking out against those notions and saying, no, this is a hardwired neurological difference. She's also wanting to, like she wanted to add neurologically different to identity categories, she also wants to think about disability differently. So at the time, there were physical, intellectual, and psychiatric disabilities. And what was then called high-functioning autism, we don't use that phrase anymore, and we'll talk about that later, but back in the 90s we did, doesn't fit those categories. It had been put in the psychiatric category, but that's not the nature of that disability. She wanted a fourth category, disabilities of social communication, which would put a lot of these neurodiverse or neurodivergent diagnoses. She also has a personal history here. Her mother had high-functioning autism and was not diagnosed until much later in life. But this led to Singer having had a childhood that was very, very challenging. Then Singer noticed that her daughter was not developing according to normal timeframes, and she ended up being diagnosed with autism. And then Singer noticed the traits in herself. So she joined a whole lot of online discussion groups, which back in the 90s were the way that people connected online. And they created a really good support system for her and helped her talk with other people and understand their experiences and make meaning of the group of, in this case, autistics and what they were struggling with. And what she was really trying to do is create a neurodiversity revolution as potent as the feminist revolution had been. So she wanted a revolution that would change society so that if there were a more understanding, inclusive, and supportive environment, there would be more possibilities and fewer difficulties for the neurodivergent. She created an online support group of her own, ASPAR, which is someone who'd been raised by a parent with autism. There were lots of people for that time. 200 people was a pretty good sized group. Things have changed with social media today. And that was a way for her and other people with similar childhood experiences to share what it felt like to have a parent on the spectrum. So she really wanted neurodiversity as a new category. And she wanted to allow for new communities to be created, like these online communities, and create a society where neurotypical people and autistics can interact in mutual respect for the differences, gifts, and deficits that each have, and where they can communicate effectively so that the differences in their languages and communication styles are no longer separating them and making it impossible for them to communicate. This is a very powerful slide for me that comes from this section of her thesis. On the left-hand side, I've put what Singer described then as conventional ways that autism was defined. There are not many changes today. And if you read through that, lack of empathy, naive, inappropriate, one-sided interaction, little or no ability to form friendships, pedantic, repetitive speech, poor nonverbal communications, intense absorption in specialized subjects, clumsy and ill-coordinated movements and odd postures, unusual prosody, accents, and voice control, the insistence on sameness, obsessive routines, and the absence of an innate theory of mind, that is, a theory of how other minds work. If you look at that left-hand column, it is all deficit language. It is very much talking about what people with autism cannot do, or characterizing what they do in a negative way, using words like clumsy, ill-coordinated, poor, pedantic. You get the idea. But if you ask someone with autism what autism is, Judy Singer did this, and I have since replicated this many, many times. And while you will hear variations among the answers, the thing that you will hear the most is what she says is a hypersensitivity to sensory stimuli, which necessitates a withdrawal from a world of overwhelming sensation. When you talk to people with autism and say, what does it feel like to have autism? You will most often hear that there is too much sensory input coming in and they need it to stop. It's all big, it's overwhelming. So there's that important piece that the first person perspective gives us a very different answer, right? The left-hand column is not a first person perspective. The right-hand column is a first person perspective. Similarly, when it comes to theory of mind, that is how other minds work and other people's perspectives, autistics do not say that they lack a theory of mind. Rather, they just don't understand neurotypical minds. They understand autistic minds really, really well. And neurotypical people don't understand autistic minds. So that disconnect does not mean there's no theory of mind. It means they don't understand the minds that are different from them and how they work. So I think this slide is really important because of the first person perspective on the right. She then goes through cultural perspectives on disability and ability in terms of capitalism and our new post-industrial society and how people with disabilities need to be able to participate in the economy and how important that is. The medicalization, the drive to classify the body and diagnose and medicalize it, which we'll talk about more today, is a power structure that gives the medical profession power over those that they classify and objectifies and segregates disabled people. And this idea of the hegemony of normalcy, which legitimizes the non-disabled normal and makes the disabled inferior, right? So there's this idea that there's some normal and anything different is necessarily lesser than. This is a very long slide that we're not going to go through the whole thing, but the point is that she knew that her mother had something seriously wrong with her when she was growing up, but she didn't know what it was like. And she describes a whole lot of things. Maddening, intolerable, like a malign force of will, an endless black hole into which all energy was leached from us. She would lash out wildly to her father, to Judy's father, with anger and frustration, and express to Judy what she called invasive love, love that seemed not to know anything about me or realize I had a mind separate from hers. And so Judy would often exclaim, "Can't you be normal for once in your life?" But it never occurred to her that maybe her mother couldn't be, right? Judy's work is part of the autistic self-advocacy movement, which came from these online discussion groups and really formed a social movement to help people understand disability and difference in a different way, and really fighting for the perspective of neurodiversity. And the objectives of that movement are recognition, civil rights and an end to discrimination, and disability services that are appropriate to how the students and how individuals most need their supports. So that's the origin of the term neurodiversity. We're going to talk now about what I think is one of the most powerful texts on neurodiversity, particularly for educators. And that is Thomas Armstrong's book, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain. And the book starts with a story called The Land of Flowers. And I'm going to paraphrase that story here. So imagine that we lived in the land of flowers, and the inhabitants of the land were all different kinds of flowers. And the psychiatrist was the rose. So the rose was the psychiatrist. And one day, a sunflower walks into the rose psychiatrist's office. The rose psychiatrist looks at the sunflower, takes some measurements, does some testing, and says, "I have to tell you, you suffer from hugeism. There's nothing we can do to change it, but here are some support groups that you can go to that will help you deal with your diagnosis." And then a cactus walks into the rose psychiatrist's office, and the rose psychiatrist says, after some tests and diagnoses, "You suffer from pricklyism. I have some medication that will help make the prickly aspects of you a little less pronounced, but we can't cure it entirely. Hopefully this will help you feel better." So I think you get the idea that what Armstrong is saying is that the medical profession tends to overdiagnose and want to treat anything that is different, that there is one way to be, and if you are not that way, you are by definition less than. Instead of the words of the great Temple Grandin, who says different, not less. Really important, right? So all of our brains are different. There is no standard brain. All the brains of all of us on this call are different. That is because of many things. A, genetics, which makes us all have different brains, but then our experiences and our activities. So I'm a singer and a pianist, and I have certain neural networks that have been activated because that's some of the things that I do. I also really love languages. I've got neural networks in my brain that have been heightened from those activities. Whatever you do and how you spend your time and your skills and the things that you've gone through in your life and learned to do, they've created different neural pathways in your neuroplastic brain so that no two people have the same brain. We have this idea that there's one normal brain and then there's the different brains. No, all of our brains are different. And whether you are considered competent in what you do is very much culturally bound. We have culturally bound notions of competence, and they change in different settings. They change in relation to what we do and how we live our lives. But these notions of what it means to be competent are contextual. So Armstrong has come up with 8 principles of neurodiversity that I think are very effective. The human brain is not a machine. It is much more of an ecosystem. So it is not a linear thing, information in, information out, like we used to think with computers. Rather, It's an ecosystem that's constantly growing and changing. Everyone has different aspects and profiles of their competence. We all have different strengths and weaknesses, and they are culturally bound. Whether or not you are considered disabled also is bound in time. So in a different time period, disability is looked at differently. What's important is that all of us match the activities that we engage in with how our brain works best. And this is what's called niche construction. And that can happen through different kinds of tools also that we use that can help us. But it also allows us to have different contexts in which we're successful. So people with disabilities can function really well and have a very active and high quality existence when you find the niche that suits you best, right? And that's thinking about what your work might be, thinking about what your leisure activities might be, but that changes your brain. As you find those activities where that suit you well, your brain continues to change through neuroplasticity. This graphic is a really good explanation of neurodiversity. In the center, it says, evolution has created specialist thinkers to bring a variety of expertise to humanity. I love that phrase, specialist thinkers. And then on the outer parts of the graphic are different bubbles with different diagnoses and some of the strengths that they bring. So we're really trying to understand neurodivergent diagnoses as full profiles. Yes, there are challenges, but there are also unique strengths that they bring. So for example, in the bottom right, ADHD, some of the strengths that some people with ADHD might have based on their brain wiring: creative ability, novel thinking, 3D mechanical ability, energy and passion. If we go to the top right, dyslexia, and there's a wonderful book called The Dyslexic Advantage that talks about this. Visual thinking, creative ability, intuition, 3D mechanical ability. Down at the very bottom, Tourette's, lots of ideas, creative ability, and cognitive control. Bottom left, autism spectrum disorder, concentration, fine detail processing, sequencing. Dyscalculia at the very top, verbal communication and intuition, and dyspraxia, verbal communication, intuition, innovation, and rapport and sensitivity. These are just some broader ways of thinking about these six particular neurodivergent diagnoses. So the term was coined by Judy Singer, high functioning autism, which is a phrase we don't use anymore. Brain differences are to be expected. There is no average or normal brain. Brain differences are not deficits. They often bring strengths to the individual, and they often bring advantages to our society. I love this video and how it summarizes the concept of neurodiversity.
Neurological differences like autism or ADHD are considered to be dysfunctional disorders and disabilities under the medical model of mental health. There's too little attention given to enabling people with neurologically different minds to be accepted for themselves, to discover and celebrate their strengths, and to find a place in society that values their differences. When most of us think of diversity, we think of things like race or sexual orientation, but there's a different kind of diversity you might not know about: neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the concept that neurological differences among people should be recognized and respected. I believe it's time for this new social movement, the neurodiversity movement, to take off. Neurodiversity is a part of our genetics and of our evolution as a species. The genes for autism and ADHD are not errors, but rather are the result of variations in the human genome that have and will continue to have advantages for society. One of the genes associated with ADHD The DRD4 gene is known as the novelty-seeking gene. It arrived on the human evolutionary scene over 10,000 years ago. Genes associated with autism also go back more than 10,000 years. Research suggests that genetic variants linked to autism might have been positively selected during human evolution because they contributed to exceptional memory skills, heightened perception in vision, taste, and smell, a precise eye for detail, and an enhanced understanding of systems such as animal behavior. These characteristics likely remain in the gene pool today because they are still advantageous. As a psychologist advising the parents of differently wired kids, I tell parents they have a choice between trying to change the child to fit the environment and changing the environment to fit the child. There are many different microhabitats and subcultures in our world. For an individual with autism or ADHD, finding success on their own terms may come from discovering the particular niche that fits best, the niche that allows their strengths to shine and their challenges to be minimized. Individuals with ADHD tend to thrive in situations of rapid change, variety, and that reward creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. A career as a comedian, detective, entrepreneur, journalist, actor, EMT technician, or photographer could be. I'm not saying that having autism or ADHD is easy. And I don't mean to downplay the real suffering that can be caused by having a neurodevelopmental condition, disability, or difference. But it's also time the world sees the beauty and value in brain differences. Neurodiversity might be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. My vision is for a neurodiversity tolerant and accepting society where differences are celebrated for the depth and dimension they bring to the human condition. I want children whose brains are wired differently to be encouraged to find their niche instead of changing to fit other people's ideas of normal. Diversity in every sense makes our world a better place, and people who think differently are a huge part of that.
So except for the fact that the numbers that they quote about levels of autism in society and all of that are out of date, everything else about that is wonderful. And I think it's particularly wonderful because it highlights a few things. Niche construction, right? Finding the niche that fits you best. Also, this one thing that I quote all the time, which is the choice between changing the child to fit the environment and changing the environment to fit the child. We want to do the latter. We do not want to change humans, right? Go back to what Ben said in our Institute video. We celebrate what makes people different and encourage our young artists to be themselves. It's not about changing the person. It's about changing the environment. So I think that's a really important point. And the point that the genes that have to do with these brain differences have been part of human society for generations and generations because they make a contribution to society. And that's a really important evolutionary perspective on neurodiversity. We're not trying to gloss over the fact that having brains that work differently is challenging. And there are real challenges that can be very, very difficult, but that can't be the only focus. And we have to understand it in a broader way. And we have to take a stance as humans and as a society that really understands neurodiversity. I'm going to stop the share because I think I'm going to go out of sequence in the PowerPoint. Hang on just a second while I get to a different place here that I think I want to get to first. Where is it? All the way there. Yeah, I'm gonna show this video now instead of later, because I think hearing a first-person perspective right now would be really helpful. So I fast-forwarded quite a bit in the slideshow. You get this is a first-person perspective on neurodiversity.
Cool. Okay. Hi. My name is Steven Zanti, and I'm a director, and a writer, an actor, a drummer, scuba diver, soccer player, a camera operator, an airbrush artist, a physicist, a stargazer, a rock climber, a snowboarder, a model maker, a stage manager, a camp counselor, a PA, a DJ, a club president, a magician, and for a brief stint in May of 2012, I was called upon to repair 2 stopwatches which had stopped working. Who am I, you ask? My name is Stephen Tonti, and I have ADHD. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder, and I was first diagnosed with ADHD not by a diagnostician or a private practice or a pediatrician, but by a 2nd grade teacher who was interviewing me for a spot at the school she was working at. Now, you see, my family had just moved from New Orleans, Louisiana to Dallas, Texas, and I was in a search for a new academic home. Now, during this particular interview, this particular teacher received a message ahead of time from my 1st grade teacher back in New Orleans to check me for any signs of ADHD. And just as she reached the series of questions devised to evaluate whether a child between the ages of 5 and 17 is ADHD, wham! I fell out of my chair. No, I didn't slip. And no, the chair didn't crumble beneath me. You see, behind the teacher's desk was this giant window. And through that window was a giant field. And on that field were what appeared to me at the time to be hundreds of thousands of kids my age. And they were all playing with a great, big, inflatable rainbow beach ball. And as they played and moved all around the field, it was all I could do to keep track of them. So I leaned a little bit to the left, and I leaned a little bit to the right, and I leaned a little bit more to the left, and a little bit more to the right before disaster. I still maintain today that window was a trap and I was set up. So I was rejected from middle school because I was an 8-year-old boy who couldn't sit still in his chair. Oh, and there was this complex marshmallow-related incident between myself and some of the staff there. But anyway, I ended up at the Episcopal School of Dallas. And over the next 11 years, I tried everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Extracurriculars. I tried computing, robotics, carpentry, canoeing, rock climbing, poetry club, logic club, poker club, comedy club, and camping. I went camping at least twice a year for 4 years. And band. Oh my God. I tried the trumpet, the saxophone, the piano, the electric bass, the stand-up bass, the guitar, both acoustic, and did I mention I played sports? It was Texas. We played sports. I tried all of them. And the drums. And I even took a short-lived stab at the harp. I played 7 different instruments. Played being a very generous term. When all of a sudden my school built a theater. And I thought, why not? So I started in the shop building sets, and then I moved to the sound booth, and then the light booth, and then my teacher asked me to act, so I played Conrad in Ordinary People. And then I said, can I direct? And she said, go for it. So I directed 12 Angry Jurors, because this is high school, people, and you can't direct 12 Angry Men with a drama school that has 3 boys and 4 girls. Yes, for the people doing the math at home, that's 7 drama students for a show with a 12 in it. And before I knew it, I was auditioning and interviewing at drama schools across the country. And that's when Carnegie Mellon found me. And I love it here. I really do. But moving on. So what? So I have ADHD. And ADHD is misunderstood as an inability to focus. But it's much stranger than that. It's not a lack of focus, period. It's that I have a hard time selecting something and giving it my full attention. Something has to grab my attention, pique my curiosity, and then I can hyper-focus. Now, this is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a bad thing because I have a hard time completing things that don't excite me. And we live in a world where you have to read your textbooks and pay your taxes. And yes, big textbooks with no pictures frighten me. And no one likes handling taxes. Well, actually, some of you might like that. But the upside is, when something does pique my curiosity, I become obsessed and I hyper-focus. I spend a lot of time with film. I can spend upwards of 12 hours in a row editing clips, sometimes until 6:30 in the morning. In the theater, when I have to put a show up, I'll pull 15-hour days for weeks on end, and I enjoy that. I love that. I can read a 500-page novel that I love much faster than a 1-page article I don't care for. It's easier for me to see the big picture. As a director, I have to track 20 people with very different jobs, from designers to writers to actors, and I find handling that much easier than finishing that 1-page article, which I'm still working on. David Neilman, the founder and CEO of JetBlue, who is also ADHD, mind you, says, I have a hard time doing the mundane things in life. I have an easier time planning a 20 aircraft fleet than I do paying my light bill. Yeah. So, another good thing about ADHD is because I felt compelled to try everything, I was able to explore all the possible career paths I might not have and might not have discovered what I truly want to do. So many teens and young adults are expected to focus on one or two fields of study and one or two hobbies and hope and pray they like the ones they've chosen or that have been chosen for them. My job is to tell other people's stories, and I find an easier time doing that when I can draw from all of these other perspectives. It's easier for me to see the world through the eyes of a drummer because I've tried that. It's easier for me to see the world through the eyes of a graphic designer because I've tried that too. ADHD is a difference in cognition, not simply a disorder. We are attention different, not attention deficit. But because it is treated and misunderstood as a disorder, it's treated as something that needs fixing. So the idea seems to be that we need to get rid of my ADHD. But there's no getting rid of it, there's just sedating it. I was lucky. My high school teachers were hip, young progressives who were delighted to give me extra time, the additional attention, and the overall freedom to express myself the way that I felt necessary. So many other kids with ADHD aren't as lucky. For example, my roommate. Adam has been my roommate for 4 years. He is an excellent actor in the School of Drama and a brilliant thinker. We both grew up in Dallas, Texas, and we both have ADHD. Adam's high school was different. Now, even though he grew up only 15 minutes north of me, Adam's high school had harsher penalties for falling out of your chair. Now, you see, when you're a kid diagnosed with ADHD, your doctor administers a series of amphetamines, and everybody waits, because no one has a clue how you'll react. You might get more calm. You might become depressed. You might lash out at the people around you. Now, the difference between Adam and me is when new medication may cause me to act out, my teachers immediately advise my doctors that I change my medication. However, when Adam tried a new medication, his teachers wrote this in his report. Adam is less motivated, less animated, and less involved in class activities, but at least he's quiet now. We need a healthier understanding of people with ADHD, and it starts at home. I had a mother and a father who supported every obsession. I distinctly recall my father asking one day, "Son, you're only 14. What could you possibly want with an air compressor?" To which I responded, "I want to airbrush t-shirts and shorts and sell them to my classmates and friends." All right then. And he would go out and he would get it, and I would play with it, and I would obsess over it. During the summers when I went off my medication and my body was wrecked with the effects of withdrawal, my mother sat by my side, literally coaxing the migraines out of me. With their support, I was able to explore, and my obsessions grew and multiplied, and I was able to maintain my sanity. Schools need to develop a better attitude towards students with ADHD as well, and there are plenty of examples out there. For instance, the Eagle Hill School in Hardwick, Massachusetts. The Eagle Hill School believes that every student can learn, that learning differently requires teaching differently, and that we must educate our kids, our students, to learn about learning in order to form new beliefs in a search for intellectual autonomy. Professors who act more as mentors as opposed to disciplinarians inspire me. When teachers level with me, I feel like I'm more in control, that there's a dialogue regarding new ways of thinking and approaching a problem, focusing, completing tasks. We have to create and develop a healthier relationship with medication. I think that Ritalin, Adderall, Concerta should only be prescribed to someone who can physically handle the effects of these drugs and their withdrawal. 12 is far too young. 16 is still too young. There are so many alternatives to medication. Studies have shown that for some, it's just an added weight or pressure to help them focus. And These things exist. There are weighted pads that help people feel more comfortable so they can complete tasks on time. For some people, it's tics like chewing pencils. So give them rubber-coated pencils. We have to teach kids to teach themselves. It's the best thing that we can do for our kids. And lastly, our society has to embrace cognitive diversity. For example, Special Eastern, or The Specialists, is a Danish organization that trains people with autism and ADHD as consultants in IT and other more technically oriented tasks and jobs. We have to turn this joke around on those who believe that my disorder divides me from my more normal peers. Besides, who here at Carnegie Mellon really qualifies as normal anyway? A great author, a masterful playwright, and a sublime poet once writ. Any guesses as to who I speak of? Shakespeare. Thou art correct. Shakespeare's Sonnet 121. 'Tis better to be vile than vile esteemed, when not to be receives reproach of being, and the just pleasure lost, which is so deemed not by our feelings, but by others' seeing. For why should others' false adulterate eyes give salutation to my sportive blood? Or, on my frailties, why are frailer spies, which in their wills count bad what I think good? Nay, I am that I am. They that level at my abuses reckon up their own. I may be straight, though they themselves be bevel. By their rank thoughts, my deeds must not be shown, unless this general evil they all maintain. All men are bad, and in their badness reign. In Sonnet 121, Shakespeare condemns hypocrisy. He implores us not to let others' false adulterate eyes condemn us for something they believe us to be. He begs you not to let the selfish and negative comments of others hinder the just pleasures owed to you. A hierarchy of frailer spies have asked me to conform to society's means, and I propose the opposite. I propose let society conform to me, and I implore you to do the same. I'll leave you with something that Robin Williams, a poster child for us in the ADHD community, once said. We are all only given a little spark of madness. You mustn't lose it. Thank you.
So there are many, many things I love about that video. The fact that it's a first-person perspective, which I think we really needed at this point. Also, he says two sentences back to back that I think are really important. The first is ADHD is a difference in cognition, not simply a disorder. I love that. So different, not less, very Temple Grandin, right? Then he says, we are attention different, not attention deficit. Again, different, not deficit. I love that. And then in the end about why should we be asked to conform to society? I propose that society conform to me. So there's a lot there to really like. So that I don't make you dizzy, I'm going to stop the share and get back to our other slide. Yeah, we were here, away from Zoom. So we will come back to some more first-person perspectives on neurodiversity shortly, but we're going to head into models of disability, and there's some connection here, which you'll see as we get there. So we do our work as educators with all students, including disabled students, of course, in the context of how disability is understood in society, by organizations, by people, by individuals, you name it. And there are several different models of that understanding, and all of them continue to exist today. So the most traditional view, which is called the medical model of disability, while it originated more than 100 years ago, it's still around. And that approach or understanding of disability is that disability is a problem that resides in the disabled person. So if you see on the left of this graphic, there is a person. That person is the problem. The individual is the problem. And it says on the right, impairments and chronic illness often pose real difficulties, but they are not the main problems. This traditional view says that disability is caused by a physical, mental, or sensory impairment, that the individual is impaired and the individual is the problem. And it is the focus of the medical profession to cure and alleviate the effect of the impairment. This goes back to the land of flowers, right? This is the medical model of disability. It focuses on assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of disability, as if a disability were the same thing as having a sore throat, right? We have a sore throat, we go to the doctor, we assess it, we diagnose it, we treat it. Disability is conceived in the same way here. The problem is the individual and their medical problems. This model emphasizes the deficit, what the person cannot do, and disabled people can never be equal in this way of thinking. Cure is desired, and cure means to normalize the individual or to make adjustments to that person. The medical model is controlled by medical professionals. It gives them the power here, as we heard from Judy Singer, and it perpetuates the perspective on disability and impairment that they are tragedies, that it's the most horrible thing to be disabled or impaired, and therefore you necessarily want to be, need to be, must be cured, right? That is the medical model. Back in the 20th century, and it started in the UK, came upon the scene the social model of disability. Remember that the medical model continues today, the social model continues today. In the social model of disability, disability lives in the barriers between the person and society. You can see that clearly in the left side of the screen. We have the person, we have society, and we have the barriers. Those barriers are where the disability lives. And they could be an inaccessible environment due to buildings, language, services, or communication that are not accessible. It could have to do with attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, for example. And it could have to do with inflexible organizations whose procedures and practices are barriers for disabled people. So the social model of disability focuses on the barriers within a society, locates the problem of disability in those barriers, and therefore society needs to change in order to increase integration and have fewer barriers. This aims to increase people's power over their own lives and strives for equity in society, education, institutions, you name it. However, at the same time, disability and impairment are still considered a problem here. And disability and impairment are still considered to have a tragedy perspective. It is a problem to be disabled, in this case by societal barriers. And there's an underlying assumption here that people with disabilities will not have access to a good quality of life. We're going to hear some first-person perspectives on the social model of disability.
I always felt being a disabled person was a problem. After learning about social model, it challenged me to look at disability completely differently. I myself was able to gain some confidence and self-esteem.
Social model basically says we are people with impairments, and those impairments clearly have an impact on how we live our lives. But the impairments are not the things which disable us.
I'm disabled by the world around me, and if the world was more accessible, I would be less disabled, and then I would just be left with my impairment, i.e. what doesn't work. It's not that my legs don't work that's disabling me, it's the fact that if I want to, if I'm on a flat surface, I can wheel around fine, I'm wonderfully happy. It's only when I come up to a flight of stairs.
As a wheelchair user, you have a slightly easier job of explaining the social model. Whereas if you're trying to explain the less physical barriers, it's much harder.
There's barriers everywhere in life to do with how we communicate, to do with people's attitudes.
discovering the social model actually was a massive liberation on another level. Yeah, I was being treated differently, and no, it wasn't me being deficient, it was everybody else's social anxieties that were being projected onto me.
The blame for you not fitting in is no longer on your shoulders.
Suddenly, my disability is out there and not in here. It was what made me realise that I was something beyond the thing that other people thought I was.
It's a real liberating thing, but it also means you can change it. We can say to the world, look, you must put a lift in this building. You must make sure that the signage is readable for people with visual impairments.
If you want that equality to be real, you've really got to then tackle the inequality people are experiencing in schools, in workplaces, with transport.
The main reason that the social model, I think, is important to disabled people is that it allows us to be a community. You achieve a whole lot more as a group.
As long as we, as disabled people, make sure that our voices are heard and that all those people that support us also have their voices heard, I think we will get there.
I hope that Scope is doing work that will help disabled people to become prouder of who we are, pushing boundaries around who can be included and where.
Come the glorious day, if it ever came, where all the barriers went, you know, we'd just be people with impairments. We wouldn't be disabled people anymore.
So that's a perspective, you know, taking into account the social model, having only the medical model to compare it to, that there's a lot of liberation that's there. In the early 2000s, we saw the emergence of the affirmative model of disability. So medical models still sticking around, social models still sticking around. Now we have the affirmative model of disability. In this model, the impairment is not the problem, rather it's learned stereotypes about disability and impairment that are the problem. This is a model where disabled people take control over their own bodies and lives. It is a direct challenge to the notion that disabled people want to be cured or should be cured. It challenges the notion of normality, puts forth a positive identity of being disabled, and is often expressed in the disability arts movement. So here we see the ways that learned stereotypes about disability can be a real problem. On the left, we see a positive way of thinking about disability. On the right, disability is portrayed as negative. So it's the same wheelchair user portrayed in two different lights. But what the affirmative model does is it puts forth a positive identity of being disabled and counters the notion that disability is something to be cured. It challenges a singular concept of normality, right? That there is no such thing as one normal way of being, and allows disabled people to demonstrate that they live wonderful, fantastic, healthy, happy lives. It is often expressed in artwork by disabled artists and also in protest by disabled activists. This long piece of text is worth reading out loud. Move this over here. The affirmative model of disability does not deny that there might be a negative side to impairment. Rather, it recognizes that impairment is not always undesirable and associated with pain or illness, but can be valuable, exciting, and intrinsically satisfying. What a concept, that impairment can be valuable, exciting, and intrinsically satisfying. Swain and French contend that the affirmative model encourages a non-tragic view of disability and impairment, which encompasses positive individual and collective social identities for disabled people. In this model, the experience of impairment is taken into account alongside the experience of living within a disabling society. So the affirmative model is not about disabled people celebrating unequal, oppressive social relationships. Rather, it is often protesting and demonstrating against marginalization and exclusion. And it's about validating the lives and experiences of people with impairments and enabling them to make sense of themselves as actors in their own cultural worlds. So it's getting rid of this presumption that disability is a negative, or in the words of disability activist Stella Young, a bad thing, capital B, capital T, when in fact, lots of disabled people are very happy with their lives and do not want anything to change. So we have to get this assumption that there's something bad that needs to change away from the thinking about disability. And that's what the affirmative model is doing. And that's where our friend Stephen Tonti was. And we're going to, before we go here, this is a good moment for our first little stretch break. So I have 2:15. Let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 2:20. I'm going to stop the share. Please keep the Zoom room open and I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Thanks.
A good chunk of your time is actually spent writing emails. If you don't
The video. There it is.
Welcome to You do not have to be disabled to experience abilities with disabilities on model of disability, telling a white shirt and a
We will be back in 1 minute. Okay, we are back. Welcome back. I am going to share my screen and show you a couple of first-person perspectives by neurodivergent musicians. The first one, oh, I've got to change that. Hold on. The first one is going to be by an orchestral musician who is neurodivergent. Okay, here we go. Here we go.
My name is Elisabeth Wiklander, and I am autistic. What do you think about when you hear the word autistic? How do you react when you hear the word autism? Would you say that it is a lifelong disorder, an impairment, a disability? This is indeed the way medical language describes it, but autism is so much more than that. No diagnostic manual can truly explain the multifaceted experience of autism. It is a neurological difference with a vast spectrum of representation within its population. It can come with remarkable gifts and skills, as well as devastating traits. But autism doesn't necessarily equal disability. And thankfully, today we have a word that challenges this negative terminology: neurodiversity. Neurodiversity describes how diverse we are as human beings from a neurological perspective. It suggests that the many variations of human brains, like autistic ones, should be accepted as a natural and valuable part of humanity's genetic legacy. DNA shows us that autism is primarily a genetic condition, something that has been passed down through generations and is still widely shared in the general population. These genes can carry something so positive, in spite of the difference they cause, that they have persisted throughout our evolution and still flourish today. Some of our important inventions, pieces of art and music, and discoveries in scientific fields that have moved our world forwards come from autistic minds. With today's exciting new technologies in neuroscience, we have seen that autistic brains differ from the norm. Not only that, but it appears as if each and every one differs in its own unique way. So, autism is rich in expression, but still faces limiting generalizations. Today, I want to talk about the autism that I display, the one that blends with normality and can have catastrophic impacts on people's lives, not necessarily because of the autism itself, but because of the ignorance of it, or the failure to recognize that it is there in the first place, as I eventually would discover. Now, in social situations, we do have expectations upon one another. We use a certain kind of rule book, which, when followed, rewards us with social acceptance. But I always felt that I was different. The trouble was I couldn't explain how, and certainly not why. it felt as if I had been provided a different rule book, and that I lacked a community to fall back upon that could confirm to me that the way I interpreted the world was valid too. So I grew up feeling very misunderstood by pretty much everybody, even within my own family. If I applied what would have been my motives, my intentions, upon someone else's behavior, or vice versa, the outcome was often negative and very confusing. So to me, the social world became scary and unpredictable. Now, I did notice, however, especially during my school years here in Sweden, that my mind had been blessed with gifts, like analytical skills, an intense mental focus, high capacity for memorizing information, which made studying very pleasurable and easy. So in my academic pursuit, I came here to Gothenburg, where I studied at the university. I later went to the Netherlands, where I attained my Master of Music. And today, I live in the UK, working as a professional cellist in the London Philharmonic Orchestra, touring the world. But this, however, is quite unusual for me, to stand on a stage just talking to you without my instrument. I can't help the feeling that I have forgotten it somewhere.
So you think you know Wix, but do you really? First up, we've got shape video masks. You can use different shapes to...
Okay, so one may now think, okay, she plays in this great orchestra. She's obviously done pretty well for herself. What's the problem? Well, I have a very literal mind. And it constantly clashes with both non-verbal and verbal subtleties in social situations. It gives me a very direct line of approach and speech in everyday conversations. I still don't really understand the purpose of small talk, although I can appreciate it now. And jokes and sarcasm fly completely over my head. My mind just takes things in so literally. It loves to analyze everything. My world is a very intense one. My senses are heightened. My brain absorbs everything in through an amplifier. My special interests can completely consume me. And my emotions, they go from the highest of high to the lowest of low, and they're on and off like a light switch. My family, bless them, they can still stand in utter disbelief when I go from a complete nuclear blast to rainbows and butterflies in less than 2 seconds, literally. So, okay, autism influences my thoughts, my imagination, my senses, my emotions, and the way I process information. But without knowing this, it was very difficult to maintain friendships because our social expectations were so different. I could come across as odd, and I experienced a good amount of bullying for it. But the most devastating were the eroding misunderstandings that dominated the relationships with the people closest to me. Body signals, misread. Words, completely misinterpreted. It was so frustrating. It was like fighting a ghost, something that no one could really grasp, not even the counselors we sought for help. So it was a mentally agonizing situation that persisted year after year. And in my mid-20s, I had reached a really dark place. And I started to be truly scared for my future. But then, something extraordinary happened that changed everything. In 2006, I heard about Asperger's syndrome. It is already an outdated term today, but it is still a form of autism on the high-functioning end of the spectrum. 3 years later, when I was 28 years old, I received this diagnosis. And I realized that a good third of my life had been based upon a false perception of myself. Imagine that. No wonder my life had been so confusing. But now I started to see myself in a new, clear context. My whole life and all my experiences just started to make sense. This launched me on an incredible journey of enlightenment and transformation. I had finally been given something that allowed me to explore the relativity of my perception of the world compared to others. I gained access into that mysterious rule book, and I could start comparing it with mine. And so I learned to identify my differences. So in the coming years, I found efficient ways to improve my social skills. I learned to verbalize my needs, recognize my limitations, and develop my strengths. I founded successful strategies to navigate my everyday life and significantly improved all the disabling traits of my diagnosis. But this took a lot of commitment, dedication, and hard work. Because autism is a spectrum, I had to become like a researcher and collect a lot of information from a lot of different sources over a long period of time in order to be able to complete my unique life puzzle. When I thought that I had reached the level of conformity that society demanded, I kept feeling that something was not quite right. Something was still missing. I could change the way I acted, but I cannot change the way I am. My natural biological calibration is and always will be autistic. And the problem I had now was to live up to these new high social standards that I had set for myself. I had come to understand my differences. But as you all know, a relationship is a two-way street. Without acceptance and understanding for the real me, I would never be truly happy. And this prompted me to one day make quite a radical move. On the 2nd of April, 2015, I announced my autism on social media. And I started to talk about it with everybody, openly, bang, just like that. I admit it was absolutely terrifying, because I had encountered what was out there, the stigma, the prejudice. I was very afraid that people would put their preconceived ideas of autism onto me rather than letting me show them what autism can look like. But this didn't happen. What happened was that my life changed completely, almost overnight. I was met with curiosity, and support started to flood in from everywhere, from friends, from family, from colleagues, and from people I didn't even know. Media started to take notice, and people who recognized themselves in my story started to contact me from near and far for help. Seeing how common the situation was, and how efficiently it could be reversed using the same tools that I had, it inspired me to share my experience further. That the knowledge of neurodiversity opens new communication channels between us by identifying differences we didn't know of before, because they have been hidden in our minds. It unlocked my world with the key to identify my differences and to communicate these in a way that we could all understand. So today, I am a very happy person. I've got wonderful friendships. I've connected deeper with my family members. And I'm experiencing what it is to be in a happy, healthy relationship with a wonderful man, who's thankfully also very patient. Because misunderstandings, they still do happen. But now they can be resolved, so they're no longer a threat to our relationship. We have taught one another to read each other's rule books, and it is enriching both of our lives. I'm still autistic, but I love it. I embrace it. I can no longer align myself with the word disabled, Because in retrospect, I understand that the suffering that I have experienced does not stem from my autism itself, but from the impacts of ignorance about it. So if we need a cure for anything, it's not for autism, it's for ignorance and intolerance.
It's time for me to get set up for therapy, and I use this room as my office. But the desk is over here, and so...
Thanks for your patience.
Differences are always challenging. But they are equally what makes this world such a beautiful and spectacular place. By recognizing how we differ from each other from a neurological perspective, helps us to coexist more smoothly without having to carve so much in our authenticity, allowing our natural skills, talents, and creativity more freedom to roam, not just for people on the autism spectrum, but for all. By joining forces, we can create a larger picture of ourselves and inspire each other on new levels. The autistic population is not an insignificant one. In the UK only, we are nearly 1 million people. So knowingly or not, you will find us amongst your friends and colleagues. We might be a family member, your boss, or a neighbor. You might have fallen in love with someone on the autism spectrum. Why? Why must we wear a one-size-fits-all? Because it fits the majority of people. Should what is neurologically accepted be determined by what's the majority? Is human value determined by what is the majority? No, of course not. But yet, a lot of autistic individuals, too many, can still not access their basic rights as citizens because ignorance of our difference still permeates every aspect of society. We deserve the same access to education, with knowledge and flexibility regarding our unique information processing. We deserve the same access to the workforce, with understanding for our sensitivity to social deciphering and sensory input. We deserve appreciation and recognition for our skills, and we deserve the same access to adequate help and support, where the true source of our struggle is better recognized. All services have to start evolving towards taking neurodiversity into account, or a lot of people will continue to fall through the net, and that is ultimately harmful to our entire society. It is unacceptable that because some don't fit a standard norm, they risk being bullied, discriminated, labeled as impaired, and pushed to the edge of society, becoming spectators behind a glass wall. It is a weakness that deprives us of contributions from unique minds that are valuable to us all. Because they're different, because they think outside the box. The quirky kid from school, like me, has just as much to offer the world as anybody else. Every human being is a resource, and society has to broaden its framework to allow everyone a place in it. This may seem a daunting task, but we mustn't be discouraged. Extraordinary things can and have been done by ordinary people, no matter through which spectrum we perceive the world. Thank you.
So there's a lot to like in this video. I love the perspective of a professional musician. I love the taking to social media to be loud and proud about neurodiversity and about her autism in particular. In our next first-person perspective, I think first-person perspectives are absolutely critical. We're going to learn about how an autistic bass player learns music. So let me do a share for that, and then we'll stop for some questions and things. Okay, so we're going to live through this ad and then we'll get there.
I don't know what Grammarly is. It's basically a digital.
We're going to talk about
folks are
bad
I work in the autism field as a consultant and mentor for young adults, and I've been a working musician since I was 16 years old. When I was 14, I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism. It happened to be the same year that I got my first bass guitar. These days, I spend more time in the autism world than on stage with bands. But I've played hundreds of gigs with dozens of bands and spent many years studying music, including several trips to Nashville, where I attended camps run by my friend and favorite musician, Victor Wooten. Both musicians and people with autism tend to see things a bit differently. To explore the ways that we think differently, I asked dozens of musicians what they think of when they hear the words C major. Their responses were varied and interesting. All white keys, the people's key, all natural, uncomplicated. My own internal process is a little different. When I think of C major, this is what I see. I don't have synesthesia. I don't see shapes and colors in everyday sounds. But like many people on the autism spectrum, I am a visual thinker. Music is the most complex thing that I know, and my mind creates visual references to manage that information. I see chords, scales, and melodies, not only as sounds, but as shapes. I see my bass as a grid, with the strings laid out in lines. When I play a note, a dot appears to mark it on the grid. I see it in the air when I play. I see it when I close my eyes. I even see it when I hear a song on the radio and I imagine how I would play it. Whether I'm playing a simple groove or a complex pattern. It all starts on my imaginary grid. Going back to C major, the scale lays out across the strings, and I can look at it in note names or in dots. The root note is always circled because that's the most important note and my reference point no matter what I'm playing. As I play through the scale, I connect each note to the next with an imaginary line, and my scale becomes a shape. Music becomes a game of connect the dots. When I play, I can remove the grid and even the dots, and I see everything in a series of lines. The harmonic minor scale has a different sound and a different shape. I think it sounds pretty cool, too. A scale is made up of 7 notes. Half the notes are chord tones, or the most important notes, and the other half are non-chord tones, or extensions, which are less important. In my mind, I can visualize that the chord tones are green and the extensions are blue. Now my visual scale has both shapes and colors, but when I play, I don't see only the notes I'm playing. I see all the notes I'm not playing, even the ones that aren't in the key. My bass lights up like a Christmas tree, with red dots filling in every chromatic note, which I like to think of as jazz notes. Every time I touch my bass, or even think of it, I see these grids that span the entire instrument and tell me about every note I could possibly play and its relationship to the key. I see shapes in chords as well as scales. When I play a chord, I draw a line from each note to the next, and I create a shape based on its fingering and position on the neck. Autumn Leaves is a jazz standard with a common chord progression, and when I play it, I imagine the chords written out in traditional music form, but I also imagine them as shapes.
There is absolutely nothing going on with me romantically.
Great. Can I buy you a drink?
Great.
When I'm on stage with the band, it all comes down to shapes, and that's how I see everything that I play. This is a melody that I wrote, and in my mind, it's a shape as well as a sound. I see that same shape whether I play it slowly or at tempo with the band like this. Now, I am a visual thinker, which is not unique. My musical system isn't unique either. There are many other musicians who use visual cues or layers of shapes in their understanding of music theory. What sets me apart is that I am autistic, and like many people on the autism spectrum, my mental transcription has extra layers and additional steps. The difference between me and other musicians is that they can put the visuals down when they put down their guitar, but many of us carry those extra steps with us everywhere we go. Our minds are filled with layers, extra steps, and detailed analysis for even the smallest things. Even having a conversation looks simple from the outside, but in my mind, I'm processing layers of information far more complex than the key of C major. Body language, eye contact, word choice, inflection, all mapped out with the same detail and complexity as a scale on my bass. While we each have a unique perspective, we often believe that everyone shares our view of the world. I played music for over 10 years before I learned that not everyone sees Autumn Leaves as a bunch of lines. Of course music is shapes. How could anyone hear this melody and not see an upside-down triangle? My hope is that when you leave here today, you'll take a moment to look at the people around you and recognize that while you all shared the same experience, everyone has a unique perspective, and you can't always see it from the outside. We have a lot of work to do in supporting those who are different and see the world differently. The first step is to recognize the differences between their view and ours. The next step is to respect those differences. We can all take those first two steps when we leave here today. Thank you.
Okay. Another really interesting and quite different perspective on Jonathan Chase's process and his thinking as a bass player about music. So I wanted to stop here and see if there are questions, comments. This is a good moment for that before we get into language. Questions, comments, wonderings, reactions. I think you have the Q&A open to you. And I can, once someone raises something in the Q&A, I can make it so that they can talk too, and we can converse that way. But I'm just going to open things up and give you all a chance to type anything you might be thinking about. Questions, wonderings, worries, issues, concerns, whatever. Reactions, you name it. Give it a little bit of time. This is a good breathing point, and a good place to just stop and process. Give it another minute. Okay, I see no questions at this point, which is great. Oh, we have one. Don wrote, I have 3 sons on the spectrum. They are so musically gifted, yet they struggle with life skills. I worry that people don't see those gifts because they don't look beyond their disability. 100%, Don. I mean, that's because we don't have a broader neurodiversity perspective in our society, right? People see something that is different, they assume it is less, they see the struggle, and they don't see anything else. They immediately classify people with this deficit model. This is why thinking about neurodiversity can really help to open up conversations as it becomes something that we get more and more traction around. It takes time. There's a lot of places where there are some really negative messages. There's a lot of ableism out there. There's a lot of discrimination, a lot of barriers, and we are nowhere near where we need to be for your sons. And I can understand that worry, because I think a lot of people don't look beyond some outward sign of their disability, and also they don't know to. It's a very strong model, this medical model, and it is held on tenaciously because people don't know even to think that there's possible strengths. So I hear you, that is really, really challenging. Interesting question from an anonymous attendee. Will we talk about mental illness being part of neurodiversity? So neurodiversity has lots and lots of different ways to frame it, and different people frame it differently. Some folks look at it really in terms of brain wiring that has to do with learning and information processing. Others include mental illness. And Armstrong, the book that I recommended to you, does not include mental illness, but there are many other folks who do include mental illness as part of neurodiversity. So I'm wondering, can I find anonymous attendee here? No, they left themselves be anonymous and I don't know who they are. So I'm wondering, we can certainly talk about it. What in particular is on your mind about it? What would you like to say about it? And what would you like to make sure that we say about it? Because yes, neurodiversity as it is defined can absolutely, and often absolutely does include mental illness. And that's a whole nother stretch, right? That's a whole nother area. And there are different stigmas there, right? And way different issues around representation and popular culture and the popular understanding that come with mental illness. And there's this idea, because mental illness is an illness, that it should be curable, when in fact, that is not necessarily the case. There are lots of procedures and medications and strategies and supports that can help people mitigate some of the effects of mental illness and exercise some control over symptoms and so forth. But it gets really tricky when we start thinking about what that means in terms of cure. So it's its own unique category that is absolutely connected and absolutely related, and that suffers from the same lack of understanding and education and the same kinds of limited perceptions and understanding in society. They're different, but they have similar kinds of limitations. So I can say that at this point, without knowing more about what your specific interest is, this work that we're doing here, since we're looking at arts education, we are looking more at neurodivergent diagnoses that have to do with learning and that have been part of learning environments in schools and so forth. But I'm happy to speak more about this and to hear more about your thoughts if you would like to share, for sure. And I'm glad that you brought it up, because neurodiversity absolutely can include more than just the diagnoses on that graphic, right? Much more than that. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts before we move on? Give it another minute just in case. Okay. So this is a good point for our second stretch break. So let's do a 5-minute stretch break here, and then we'll come back and look at language. So I will see you, I have 3 o'clock. I will see you at 3:05. Thank you. Back in about 2 minutes. Coming back in just under 1 minute. All right, so we're back. We're going to look at issues of language. And this chart always gets a lot of interesting reactions. So language about disability is constantly changing. I have a feeling that next year when I revise these slides for this particular event, we will be looking at a different chart. So it's a changing, moving field, and we need to keep up with it. So one aspect of language is the person first language versus the identity first language, right? So person first, meaning person with a disability, identity first, disabled person. Person first, person with autism, identity first, autistic person. When in doubt, ask the person or group which they prefer. These are used when speaking about disabled people. You'll notice that I go back and forth between the two. And if you are able to ask the person or group you are speaking about, you should use their preference. Generally speaking, organizations tend to use person first language, and the disability advocacy community tends to prefer identity first language, but there are all kinds of reasons for different kinds of preferences. The big headline is that we have to respect the wishes of the disabled community. That is absolutely paramount. Then there's the what can we say, what shouldn't we say, how do we feel about this, what's the deal? So according to the disability community, we do not want to say functioning language anymore, high functioning, low functioning. Who is anybody to determine a person's level of functioning? In addition, it's an awfully superficial, single, variable description of a human being. We all have different ways that we function in different domains, and placing a value of high or low is really counterproductive. So we don't have perfect language to take its place, but the language that the disability community is now saying will work, although it's imperfect, is to talk about support. So someone who needs minimal support, someone who has high support needs. That at least doesn't make a judgment on a person's level of functioning, which is a real problem. It's offensive. Medical model language, talking about someone having a mild, a moderate, a severe disability, a classic symptoms, that kind of thing. We are not in the business of diagnosing other people. We should not use those terms. They are shorthand that is inappropriate and offensive for people to use. Similarly, we should not label people, say that someone is on the low end of the spectrum or the high end of the spectrum. Again, it's too simplistic, and it creates judgments, and labels tend to be really static, and they don't allow for the dynamic relationships and development and the sort of dynamic nature of being a human being. So we don't want to use that. There are several terms that are outdated that I don't even want to read out loud, but there are 4 of them there that are insulting because they are outdated. And then there's euphemistic language like handy-capable, differently abled, and special needs. And people with disabilities find that language offensive. Don't give me euphemisms. What you're doing there is saying that you can't just come out and say the facts. Factual language is what we need to use. You say the person is disabled, the person has a disability. All that other euphemistic language is non-disabled people who are uncomfortable saying the true fact, disabled, disability, so they use these euphemisms. It ends up being insulting, it ends up being patronizing. So a lot of people have trouble, non-disabled people have trouble saying someone is disabled, someone has a disability, someone has autism, someone uses a wheelchair, someone is autistic, someone is deaf, someone is blind. But that is really what the disability community wants us to do. And we have to respect their wishes. Far be it from me to tell somebody else how they should be referred to. I want to respect the wishes. And when you have any opportunity to ask the person, ask them, because that's even better. You're honoring the wishes of the specific individual. So that's the first piece about language. This is a slide about person first versus identity first language. So organizations tend to use person first language, but some consider person first language to be offensive and overly euphemistic. Some can see person first language as being aligned with the medical model of disability. Person with autism, well, you could take away the autism and they'd still be a person. So it sort of has an underlying message of we want to take away the disability. And it can be considered to perpetuate the tragedy perspective. Because disability is such a tragedy, we want to take it away, right? Identity first language is often preferred by disability self-advocates, but some think it's a little too much in your face, and it can make some non-disabled people uncomfortable to say autistic person, disabled person, deaf person, etc. And some consider it aligned with the social and affirmative models of disability by putting the disability first and saying that that's an integral part of someone's identity. So this is an important thing to think about. The bottom line, when you can ask, you should ask, because that will be by far the best way. Before we get to that, we also have other forms of language that are ableist, that are important to talk about here. Simple little microaggressions, like saying that the traffic was crazy, or saying that something's driving you insane, or saying that you are deaf to that idea, or saying that you are blind, you're the blind leading the blind. Using language like this in everyday speech is a microaggression and is highly problematic. And we need to get these words out of everyday speech. There have been some recent, very public examples of song lyrics. My cat is meowing at me. Yeah. There have been some really public instances of song lyrics and folks who have changed song lyrics because they used terms that were considered offensive and were considered microaggressions. They didn't know, and they found out, and they changed the song lyrics. We need to be really mindful of the words that we choose. Similarly, I have a real problem with people who throw around diagnoses in everyday conversation, where they say something like, oh, I'm so ADHD today. Like, that is offensive. That is a microaggression. ADHD is a diagnosis. You are not a diagnostician. We don't use it as an adjective, right? We don't say to somebody else, I met this person, they kind of acted like they were on the spectrum. No, we don't use diagnoses or terms related to diagnoses to function as shorthand about other people. And we don't even informally diagnose other humans with language. Very offensive, really problematic. I want to show you a video of the late, great Stella Young, who talks about inspiration porn, which is a whole nother ableist linguistic trope that we need to, as a society, do much better. And I have it queued here. This TED Talk has been extremely influential. It is the TED Talk in which the term inspiration porn was coined.
I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. I went to school, I hung out with my friends, I fought with my younger sisters. It was all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah. And they were right, I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right. You know, I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later, I was on my second teaching round in a Melbourne high school, and I was about 20 minutes into a Year 11 legal studies class when this boy put up his hand and said, "Hey, miss, when are you going to start doing your speech?" And I said, "What speech?" You know, I'd been talking to them about defamation law for a good 20 minutes. And he said, you know, like your motivational speaking. You know, when people in wheelchairs come to school, they usually say, like, inspirational stuff. Yeah. It's usually in the big hall. And that's when it dawned on me. This kid had only ever experienced disabled people as objects of inspiration. We are not, you know, to this kid, and it's not his fault. I mean, that's true for many of us. You know, for lots of us, disabled people are not our teachers or our doctors or our manicurists. We're not real people. We are there to inspire. And in fact, you know, I'm sitting on this stage looking like I do in this wheelchair, and you are probably kind of expecting me to inspire you, right? Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you dramatically. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to tell you that we have been lied to about disability. Yeah, we've been sold the lie that disability is a bad thing. Capital B, capital T. It's a bad thing. And to live with disability makes you exceptional. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't make you exceptional. And in the past few years, we've been able to propagate this lie even further via social media. You know, you may have seen images like this one: the only disability in life is a bad attitude. Or this one: your excuse is invalid, indeed. Or this one: before you quit, try. Yeah. These are just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of these images out there. You know, you might have seen the one, the little girl with no hands drawing a picture with a pencil held in her mouth. You might have seen a child running on carbon fibre prosthetic legs. And these images, you know, there are lots of them out there. They are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. But what if you are that person? I've lost count of the number of times that I've been approached by strangers wanting to tell me that they think I'm brave or inspirational. And this was long before my work had any kind of public profile. They were just kind of congratulating me for managing to get up in the morning and remember my own name. And it is objectifying. These images objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. You know, they are there so that you can look at them and think that things aren't so bad for you, to put your worries into perspective. And life as a disabled person is actually somewhat difficult. We do overcome some things, but the things that we're overcoming are not the things that you think they are. They are not things to do with our bodies. I use the term disabled people quite deliberately because I subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which tells us that we are more disabled by our bodies, the society that we live in rather, than by our bodies and our diagnoses. So I've lived in this body a long time. I'm quite fond of it. It does the things that I need it to do, and I've learnt to use it to the best of its capacity, just as you have. And that's the thing about those kids in those pictures as well. They're not doing anything out of the ordinary. They are just using their bodies to the best of their capacity. So is it really fair to objectify them in the way that we do, to share those images? People, when they say, you know, you're an inspiration, they mean it as a compliment. They mean it as a compliment. And I know why it happens. It's because of the lie. It's because we've been sold this lie that disability makes you exceptional. And it honestly doesn't. And I know what you're thinking. You know, I'm up here bagging out inspiration. You're thinking, geez, Stella, aren't you inspired sometimes by some things? And the thing is, I am. I learn from other disabled people all the time. I'm learning not that I'm luckier than them, though. I am learning that it's a genius idea to use a pair of barbecue tongs to pick up things that you drop. I'm learning that nifty trick where you can charge your mobile phone battery from your chair battery. Genius. We are learning from each other strength and endurance, not against our bodies and our diagnoses, but against a world that exceptionalizes and objectifies us. I really think that this lie that we've been sold about disability is the greatest injustice. It makes life hard for us. And that quote, "the only disability in life is a bad attitude," the reason that that's bullshit is because it's just not true. Because of the social model of disability, you know, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a rap. Never. You know, smiling at a television screen isn't going to make closed captions appear for people who are deaf. You know, no amount of standing in the middle of a bookshop and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I really want to live in a world where disability is not the exception but the norm. I want to live in a world where a 15-year-old girl sitting in her bedroom watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer isn't referred to as achieving anything because she's doing it sitting down. I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names in the morning. I want to live in a world where we value genuine achievement for disabled people. And I want to live in a world where a kid in year 11 in a Melbourne high school is not one bit surprised that his new teacher is a wheelchair user. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does. Thank you.
So that TED Talk is extremely well known, and Stella Young's work is extremely well known. And I think the inspiration porn concept has been a very effective tool for folks in terms of critical consumption of social media and images, and thinking about what it really means when we see that material, and what messages are being sent by our society. I'm going to pause and see if there are questions or comments on this piece before we go back to the language piece for one more chunk before another little video. Give it a minute or two since people have to type. I'm not seeing anything. Let me give it a little longer. Thank you for that. I'd never heard of Stella Young. Are there other videos and writings of hers that you would recommend? Yes. I've read pretty much everything I could get my hands on. That's the best video. Google Scholar her. You won't go wrong. I think what she has put out in the world is pretty incredible. She is no longer with us. Big loss. And I think what she has to say is profoundly important. So Search for her on Google Scholar and you'll find some good things there. I'm glad that that was helpful. What would be the best way to have representation in the classroom? I'd like all my students to see themselves. Oh, and hi, Michelle. Thanks, Allison. Fabulous question. So, you know, what we need to do is find sources, materials, and broader references in popular culture, as well as actual human beings, to be part of our classrooms that give us broader representation. So there's a wonderful book called Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, and that traces particularly autism over many, many, many generations. And for a very, very long time, the only representation of an autistic person in popular culture was Rain Man, which is a 1989 film with Dustin Hoffman. And the character that Dustin Hoffman plays is actually a compilation of a few different people in that story. And people had this idea that autism only looked that way. And even still, the representations in general popular culture and public media are quite narrow of autism, of other neurodivergent diagnoses. And this also gets tricky too, because there may very well be people in media and popular culture who have ADHD or dyslexia. I mean, we see all these famous people who had this disability, right? So we know this is true, but they're not out there talking about it for the most part. We don't really see positive representations and diverse representations being put forward. So, I mean, for all we know, you know, in our schools, we've got all kinds of invisible and visible disabilities and challenges. Yet, how are they demonstrated, expressed, shared, right? Because of the kinds of stigma that I was talking about before. So what I would suggest, Michelle, I teach a number of courses in the graduate programs that I was telling you about, and we always have first-person perspectives. I have found people, I have found videos of, and some of them I shared today, of first person. I mean, that's why our podcast is also guest hosted by disabled artists, because it's very important. It's got to be nothing about us without us. It's got to be that perspective. We've got to be changing the representation. And there are a lot of people working to do this, but you know how these things unfortunately end up being, right? It ends up being the disabled people who are doing the work and who are educating and who are given that task. And that is not fair. We all need to be educating. We all need to be learning. We all need to be seeking out broader representations and be critical about the representations that we do see. You know, there's the television show, The Good Doctor, that has a person with autism and savant syndrome that is played by a person who does not have a disability. There have been other television representations and film representations where it is a person with a disability who is playing a person with a disability, right? And then what about people with disabilities playing people without disabilities? We need broader representation across it all. And we need educators with visible disabilities and those with invisible disabilities to be more public about this. It's a big challenge. Thinking about the space in your classroom, I would think about first-person voices and the different ways that you could provide that. Elizabeth has a comment. I feel the stigma. I am autistic, but I don't know how to talk about it with my students. They know I have sensory differences, but don't know I'm autistic. That is a big challenge. And obviously, it is a personal decision how you want to talk about it, if you want to talk about it, what you do and don't want to say, right? Totally individual and personal. And I understand your desire to do that. I mean, it's great that they understand the sensory differences, but I don't think there's one way, right? It's an individual thing. It also matters how your community is around disability and around, in this case, autism. How is that a part of your community at the school? When and how would it feel safe, right? excuse me, to do so. So it may, it may be something that's less, I have this diagnosis, and more like particular things that impact particular situations or particular lessons or particular contexts, right? So maybe the sensory thing is enough for them to know now, but if something else comes up that rubs up against some other aspect of your autism, rather than saying autism, because you're right, that word has a stigma and we don't know where your students are with it, and where your school community might be. If it, maybe it's, I prefer not to have fluorescent lighting in my classroom, and that might be part of your autism, right? But you may be able to speak about components that are affecting a particular thing rather than coming out there with, this is my diagnosis. And I think that's true for all the neurodivergent diagnoses, for any disability. I think it's true in terms of mental illness, right? We have a lot of stigma as a larger society, and in all of our subcultures and other organizations and communities. So, far be it from me to tell a person how to do that. That is a completely individual thought process and set of decisions. But it might be that rather than going big, you go little. That's one possibility, and something concrete that directly affects what's happening might be a little easier for people to understand. I don't know the age of your students, but I'm guessing that might help. I have seen educators self-identify, and say, I have this, I am this. It really depends on the community you're in and on your comfort level and how is it something you want to teach them about? That's another way in, or not, right? So really challenging. I'm glad. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I can definitely see how that could be really, really tough to navigate. I am going to take us back to here. So this is where we were with person first and identity first language, and then autism. So I love this diagram. So we talk about the autism spectrum, which makes us think of a straight line. And that's when we start thinking, we used to say high functioning and low functioning, depending on where you were on the spectrum, right? At the upper end of the spectrum, the lower end, and all of that is super offensive. And that linear representation is way overly simplistic. So autism, and this is true with any disability or diagnosis, but we're using autism as a case here, has many components. And people have different strengths and different challenges on different components here. We have, completely jagged profiles. So one particular person with autism might have a lot of sensory sensitivity, where someone else might have much less. Someone might have cognitive function that is, they're extremely strong cognitively. Somebody else might be extremely strong with their executive function. Someone else might have weaker motor skills or weaker language skills. These are just a few of the items, but to think of it more as, and I like to think this as three-dimensional, like a sphere, and that everybody's profile is all different segments in the different dimensions of the sphere, right? So it's not linear, it's much more complex, and it's changing. I know a lot of people with different neurodivergent diagnoses who will say, when I was younger, my ADHD was like this. But now that I'm older, my ADHD looks like this, right? Matt Savage, who is a Berkeley alum on the spectrum, will talk about how he was, when he was younger, he uses the phrase more autistic than he is now. And he talks about those differences quite a bit. So it changes over time in all different ways. It's not linear. And I like that sphere model a lot in terms of our thinking around any of these diagnoses. There's a really fun comic, which I think I have to unshare and reshare. So I'm going to reshare it. Where did it go? There. Okay, so I'd like to walk through this comic because I think it's pretty fun. It's about autism. Language can be confusing for me. It takes me longer than the average person to process conversations. And although I am good at making conversation, it can take me longer than normal to respond. But neurotypical people find language confusing too. And it can lead to some people misperceiving who I am. That is why I would like to explain what is meant by spectrum when we talk about the autistic spectrum. Some people, when they think of this word, they think of the autism spectrum as being like this: not autistic on the left, very autistic on the right. And it says a very linear looking spectrum, which gives people the impression that people range from being a little autistic to very autistic. How can you be a little autistic? It's that vague language that I always find confusing. The problem with thinking of the spectrum in this way is that a perception of an autistic person also becomes linear. You're only a little autistic, Archie. I still don't understand. Can you be less vague? You're able to have a normal conversation with me and act pretty normal. You're not severely autistic. And so you see, if someone thinks you're on the quote unquote low end of the spectrum, this often happens. Archie, you can handle all of this just fine. You're not that autistic. How can you be tired? Everyone does this every day. You're just being lazy. Wow, you're being so overdramatic. Get over it. Whoa, you're more autistic than I thought. I'm going to relabel you on this spectrum. Since you're very autistic, I don't think you should have a job just to be safe, you know? And if you're being seen as on the high end of the spectrum, it can lead to some people labeling you as being incapable of doing anything at all, if you're considered very autistic. The truth is, though, someone who is neurodiverse in some areas of their brain will also be no different to your average person in other areas of the brain. And that's another example of a similar kind of sphere. You see, the autistic spectrum looks something more like this. The spectrum consists of many different traits or ways in which the brain processes information. Some traits create difficulties in everyday life, hence being diagnosed. But also many traits are useful in everyday life, like perception. Each person with autism will have a set of traits all in different areas of that spectrum. The areas where they don't have a trait will function no differently than a neurotypical brain, but may be affected by circumstances. For example, I am good at making conversation, language, but I get sensory overload in loud and crowded spaces, which then makes conversation very hard for me. And so another autistic person might be very happy in loud crowds, but find conversation hard in general. You can see with this spectrum then that not every autistic person has quote unquote savant skills, or someone who can't communicate verbally might still understand what you're saying, but just need a different way to communicate, such as sign language. It shows how not every autistic person acts the same way, and we're all capable of varying strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes if someone is diagnosed as being, quote, on the spectrum and informs another person of this, it's so that they can get some understanding and respect for the things that they are unable to do. But it is also so that they can cooperate with the world around them so that they can be the best in the things they can do. I hope that in the future, people will better understand the term spectrum and continue to respect the differences and similarities we all share in how we experience the world. So that's a cartoon that illustrates that point about the spectrum. We are coming up against time. I think we are very close to the end here of the slideshow. Yes, we are. So circling back, what did you learn about neurodiversity today? Please jot something in the Q&A. What did you learn about neurodiversity, models of disability, or language today? What did you learn today? Some of the words used to describe people with disabilities are not acceptable anymore. It's true. It's something that has been a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge because language continues to evolve. Like I said, a year from now, we may have a whole different set of words that we need to think about differently. How the community uses person-first and identity-first language, and how that differs from person to person and group to group. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Thank you for highlighting the correct language we should be using at this time, Allison. My pleasure. As I said, constantly changing. I really appreciate learning about the affirmative model and social model of disability. I'm glad to hear it. I think those can be really helpful frames. I'll give it another minute, and then I'm going to go back to logistics and make sure there are no questions there, and then I'll send us off on the rest of our Saturday. So another moment, just in case there's people who are typing or thinking. I really like the graphic describing autism as a wheel. Oh, I'm glad. I think the terminology and language we use is important. I think it's important to keep up. Yes. I just read the blogs of disability self-advocates. That's how I follow a bunch on Instagram as well. That's how I keep up and try to stay current with where folks are at. I am going to, there's one more. A visual learner yourself, you love that. Great. I'm glad that's helpful. And you will get these slides emailed to you early next week. I'm going to just make sure that we're, questions, discussion, and there's some resources and upcoming events and contact information for you. So I'm going to stop that share and reshare the logistics slideshow, just so we walk through them one more time. Here we go. And you will get the logistics slideshow sent to you as well. Oops, I can't do that. In order to share it, I have to do it this way. Here we go. So this is logistics. Let me get this slideshow rolling. You saw this before. This will be quite familiar. We have 6 sessions, right? I'm not going to go through them all again. Our next session's next week. The thing to know is that the afternoon session starts at 2:30, not at 1. And so that's the only change. But we've got 6 sessions and the content is right there. You will get video recordings no later than Tuesday, probably multiple messages from me with video recordings, with the slideshows from this one and both other slideshows, as well as the Google Doc for the between session engagement prompt and the Google Doc about projects. And that's what we've come with here. Remember that if you want full participation and to get a certificate of participation and professional development points, if you're in Massachusetts, you need to attend 18 hours of sessions. You need to do that between session engagement for all 5 times that it goes out with different prompts about different sessions, and you need to create and present a project. Projects are a snapshot of a way that you're applying something that you learn here to your practice. Very wide-ranging possibilities. We don't want to try to do too much. They are works in progress. And they have different deliverables depending on what you are doing. Will depend on how you document it. You'll do a 5-minute presentation, or I will present on your behalf if you can't be there, and I will give feedback. And I will put out a Google Doc where you can start, you can put in a tentative idea and you can get some feedback about it. And that is the logistics. And I'm going to stop the share again and just make sure we have no questions about any logistics before we go on our merry way for Saturday, the rest of the day. I'll give it a little bit of time just in case there's anything that has come up. Yes. If you are attending both level 1 and level 2, you will have to do 2 session engagement docs. Yes, there's one for level 1 and one for level 2. If you want credit, double the credit, then yes. 2 questions and no at all need to apologize, Allison. Can you do a group project with participants who are participating predominantly in level 1? Yes. If you're partly synchronously, how do I know? We have IP addresses, and we have that information from your application registration form, and we follow the IP addresses and we map them, and that's how we can tell. So no worries about that. We can definitely tell that you've attended the sessions. I'm glad that you like the first person perspectives, Moniz. I feel like there is no substitute. I can sit here and talk about this all day, but my words ring hollow when it comes to what it's really like. And that to me is the guts of it. Remember that slide with the 2 halves and why I'm crazy about that second half. I'm just in love with that second half. What you will get in Washington State is a certificate of participation. It only works for professional development points in Massachusetts, but that certificate will show that you participated in the 18 hours. We do not provide graduate credit for this work. It is only professional development points and certificates of participation. Anything else on this or anything before we go? Yes, Allison, these 18 PDPs go directly toward the SPED PDP requirement in Massachusetts for music teachers. Do you still present if you're out of state? Everything happens on Zoom, right? The project presentations happen on Zoom, Elizabeth. So it doesn't matter where you are. You can be on vacation in Tahiti and do it. And we will welcome it, absolutely. So the full participation gets you the certificate, right? Again, the word credit is a misnomer. No one's getting credit. We don't provide graduate credit. You get a certificate of participation. If you are out of state, that is all it is. If you are in state, that certificate will get you 18 professional development points in Massachusetts. That is all. But in order to get that certificate of participation, you have to do a project. Does that make sense, Elizabeth? Please tell me. Okay, good. You do understand. Cool. Other things. I'm feeling good. All right. We're a speck early. Nothing wrong with that. I'm going to wish you a great rest of your Saturday. Watch your email Monday or Tuesday. We will get those out to you, and it'll be multiple messages because the videos are large. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. It's a pleasure to work with you this afternoon. Bye-bye.